Excellent contributions, plenty of food for thought. There are details we could flesh out. We could talk about O'Neill's raising nationalist hopes, the failure to site the second university in Derry in 1965, despite a cross-community consensus on it, despite the cavalcade to Stormont, led by the mayor, the Unionist mayor, and John Hume. And all of that, the fact that Lemass urged Eddie McAteer and his party to assume the role of official opposition at Stormont in 65, and almost immediately nationalist kind of faith in O'Neill was beginning to fritter away by that stage. So there are issues like that people may wish to raise on it, but we'll open it to the floor, to points of discussion. And yes, sir.
Just a point, first of all, with Margaret. You were talking about the 1966 commemorations and the significance of that. I think one significance of that was that at the time, this was just at the end, 4 years after the end of the border campaign. There was the Republican movement, or the new Republican leadership, were taking a new direction.
Sure.
Into socialist politics and anti-sectarian politics, which caused them problems later on in '69, where they were being forced to, they were being criticised for not defending capital.
Well, it's the Goulding McGilliwan you're
yes.
talking about. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So, so this was 4 years after that, and there was a great fear that the '66 commemorations, which were banned. The Republican movement at that time wasn't banned. It was illegal. So here they were.
No, the commemorations were not banned.
Well,
the organisation of the IRA was banned.
Yeah, and the Republican clubs were banned. And the people who were organising,
Republican clubs were banned in the middle of the year, I think, later in the year.
67.
No, 67
but,
Republican clubs were banned.
but they adopted the title Republican clubs because at that time.
I know that.
So the organisers were acting illegally.
Now, hang on a minute. What's the question?
So the thing is, in the Unionist community, perhaps there was a vision that here are the Republicans being resurrected again.
Oh, of course there was.
Just 4 years after, and the Liver Street riots was.
There was, of course. And I mean, the point about the commemoration is that there were. The organisation of the commemorations, even by Republicans in West Belfast, was not secret. If you go to the Irish News, there's notifications given for months in advance. It's publicly advertised as a massive commemoration. So yeah, of course there was all kinds of apprehensions about it, but that kind of was my point, that Paisley in the Protestant Telegraph from 65, from when the commemorations are mooted, that's what he's focusing on. Yeah. So yes, of course, yes. But I mean, we're kind of talking about the mentality within which unionism is encouraged to live, right? So the language that, for example, you just quoted from O'Neill it's reflective of O'Neill to one degree, but it's also reflective of the way the unionist electorate have been spoken to by their politicians over a 40 or 50-year period. I think O'Neill, who's a bit of an outsider, is almost innocent in trying to bridge what he hears from his unionist colleagues all the time in an attempt to shift the ground of his supporters. So yeah, I perfectly accept that the 66 commemorations did destabilise unionist public opinion. But I suppose my core point would be it didn't take much to destabilise unionist public opinion. Every single shift and change from the early 60s onwards seemed to destabilise things.
I suppose the point I was trying to make was that the Republican movement were taking a new direction which frightened the Union state. And in fact,
but I don't think unionists were frightened by what they saw as a new direction. I think they were frightened in 66 of what they thought looked like an old story, that here everybody was out commemorating 1916. And the Royal Ulster Constabulary at the time have quite a lot of stuff on how unionists are organising militarily through 65, 66. Like I published with Catherine O'Donnell quite a detailed article on how in '66 the RUC are briefing O'Neill that they are extremely worried about how groups around Paisley, a whole set of organisations, are worried about change, also paramilitarising, and this isn't just the UVF. So yeah, sure, but it's not just '66. That's
there's one thing I would say. I don't think the effect of '66 lasts. You know, I mean, there's an endless history of
it's just
commemorations of this, that, the other.
I mean, the Psalm is remembered the same year.
What?
And the Psalm is remembered, and the Larne gun running was remembered.
But by the time you get to 67, 68...
There is part of Myrtle as well.
Yes, indeed. Well, sorry, we better give somebody else a chance maybe and come back. Is there anybody else who would like to raise anything on this? Yes, Margaret.
I remember I was working in the city hospital in the late 60s, and it was around about the time that there were blowing up the water mains and all that sort of thing. And I think that it later transpired.
Loyalist paramilitaries did them all.
But at the time it was thought...
It was Republicans.
So I'm just wondering if that was maybe an effort by the unionist paramilitary wing type, that they saw what was happening in '66 and shortly
some of the
after
people
it,
are...
and that they did this in order... Because I remember at one stage, I was working in the hospital at the time, and I remember one day one of the patients saying to me, Margaret, you're a Catholic. Could you please tell me why it is that how my having to do without my bath every day is advancing republicanism? And
that's brilliant. You should write a book with Alison title.
Can I
think that some people did see it as that.
Can I make a couple of points there, just looking at these state papers year on year for about 30 years? First of all, the Unionist government by 1959 knew that the IRA camp was virtually dead, the IRA campaign. It wasn't called off until February '62, but it was effectively dead on its feet within about a year and a half because of internment north and south. And nobody preached that more in the cabinet than Brian Faulkner, who had been Home Affairs Minister, that the IRA campaign had been effectively defeated by policing and security measures north and south. But Paisley in '64, I remember it very well actually, September '64, I remember there was a Westminster election. The Republicans ran a candidate in West Belfast. Paisley discovered there was a flag in an office in West Belfast, the Republican headquarters, and he said if the police didn't remove it, he would lead a crowd. Now, I remember that very well because I remember acrid smoke coming into our school, and I remember trolleybuses being burned. And all of that, suddenly on an ordinary working day with kids going to school, and suddenly this was the first serious violence in West Belfast since 1935, and Paisley had made that threat then. We move on to '66, of course you have the commemoration of the Easter parades, but of course to the ordinary unionist, the IRA had been quiescent since 1962 officially, but they had no sense that under this new left-wing policy, the IRA and republicanism was moving towards political tactics north and south. They had no sense of that. Unionism did have a sense of that, but within the cabinet, it was always the 12th of July kind of mantra at that time to raise the threat of an armed IRA campaign that justified the continuation of the B specials, which aren't, remember, abolished until part of the reform package in 1970. You've got all of that going on. So the other thing about the pipelines was those explosions weren't until 1969. O'Neill wrote that he was literally blown out of office by a series of events in March, April 1969. It started with a minor explosion beside Queen's University on board Wanya had headquarters on University Road. I remember going up to see that. The place was blown up. This was amazing, a small bomb. Then it suddenly was the Castlereagh electrical station. It was other waterworks. And for a couple of months, the police said they believed, if you read their reports to the Ministry of Home Affairs, this was the IRA. It suddenly transpires it wasn't the IRA. And in my days as a student, I remember being allowed to see, we were the first people to organise the files under the 30-year rule. And we saw everything from the 20s. But we wrote such good reports, they were all clawed back, some of them closed for 100 years. But anyway, one file was particularly interesting. The RUC Special Branch went to every meeting that Paisley addressed that they could. Every public meeting, the Ulster Hall was a favourite place. He was probably sitting beside John that famous day. But anyway, what they did was they minuted everything, and they produced this kind of triplicate document. I can see it yet. And it was the membership of 3 organisations. The Ulster Protestant Volunteers, an organised paramilitary force headed by Paisley. The Ulster Constitutional Defence Committee, an organisation headed by Paisley, and the UVF. And in 4 out of 6 of the sort of Drumalis personae, they had the same people in all organisations. And they had question marks at the top of the UVF. And close suggestions that Paisley was certainly very close to these people at that time. And of course, Margaret talked about the murder. That was the Malvern Street
To go
murder.
back to that, we published that. We published an article about those documents, myself and Catherine MacDonald. It's in Irish Political Studies for 2007, so you can get it online. But we had terrible difficulty getting it published anywhere. A number of journals wouldn't take it, and it seems like the most boring article you ever read, because all we can say in it is the document says, it is suggested. And Irish Political Studies, who normally, publish anything that passes academically, were like, said to me, like, have you got your own legal cover on this?
Because
No, but I think it was because Paisley was so litigious that, the whole literature or the whole academic work on Paisley is completely distorted by the fact that he was litigious in terms of work, but also in relation to scholarly work.
But I mean, the Stevenson trial on the pipelines, it's very, very interesting in that whole period. There's a whole backstory to that. But I mean, effectively, the ordinary Protestant Unionist person in Northern Ireland had no sense that the IRA was changing, that the pipe was in the thatch. I mean, I know that's very important in the formation of civil rights. Another question or point?
I don't want to hog, but I also remember when I was getting off the bus to go into work, seeing the posters along the Donegal Road entrance of the City Hospital, which said, Northern Ireland is facing a Republican takeover. And that was the way the civil rights agitation was being represented within the Protestant community.
And in fairness, probably how it was perceived, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, from the very beginning, William Craig, the Minister of Home Affairs, proclaimed it as a Republican plot. And he maintained that. O'Neill sacked him 2 months later in December 1968, and he took the message then to the public stage. Paisley was saying the same thing, and O'Neill was having to warn his cabinet by the end of October 68 under massive pressure from Harold Wilson, who had been monitoring O'Neill for the last couple of years. And the idea was, let's trust Terence. Terence will deliver. The reason was, of course, that O'Neill wasn't really an Ulster Unionist, although his father had been a Unionist MP for Mid-Antrim, but he was the first MP killed in the First World War. So O'Neill's father was killed almost as soon as the war opened. But he was reared with his mother's people. And his grandfather was the Marquis of Crewe, who was one of Asquith's Home Rule ministers, who had been very much a major speaker on Home Rule platforms, a British aristocrat. And O'Neill was brought up in Crewe Castle in the north of England, with Asquith for dinner every week, and Carson's name on the bottom of a chamber pot. I mean, that was his real background. So he reinvented himself as an Ulster Unionist. He had been in the catering corps in World War II. You know the famous story about O'Neill when he came to Glebe House O'Hochel in 1945 to find a base with a view to going into politics. And the first morning he and his young bride were there, they heard this music on the lawns. It was the 12th of July. And O'Neill looked out and he saw the local Orange Lodge parading up and down outside his house. Get off, you blighters. And then a week or two later he said he would like to enter politics. And somebody said, you have to join the Orange Order. And he had to join a lodge about six miles up the road, Carnalbana Lodge, because he had offended the local lodge. So he really didn't have a great nous for local politics. He brought these British liberal values to the Irish situation at that time.
Do you remember Sam Thompson, was it a television play?
Yeah.
About
Over the bridge.
About a very similar unionist politician who arrived from England or whatever, and absolutely no conception of what the local scene was, and then it turns out he's got a Catholic wife. and it all goes downhill from there.
He also wrote a play called The Evangelist,
Yes.
which was based very much on Paisley.
Yes, that's right.
I saw that
That's
play
right.
several times.
And I quite wanted to raise with Myrtle as well. You talked about the McCluskeys and the nationalist politicians, and I think it was very unfortunate, and it's still affecting us today. But there was a focus on discrimination against Catholics, and the nationalist political politicians and the re-emergence of nationalism under the SDLP. Civil rights then became civil rights for Catholics, and that was very unfortunate because NICRA was always civil rights for everyone, irrespective of religion. And there were many Protestant working class people whose housing conditions were no better. And if that line had been followed, that this is not civil rights for Catholics, and I think we may have saved a lot of grief.
I think it's very interesting, especially when we talk about high politics, and then you think, but why do these people keep voting the way they do? I used to be ashamed to say this, right? But this is my background. I grew up in a wee Protestant housing estate near Andersontown when it was the only little Protestant housing estate there. Very working class family. And you didn't need to scaremonger. I mean, I knew if you give, I don't know who told me, but I knew if you give Catholics a house, they'd put cone bath. You know, I remember meeting a nun. I mean, the most horrific thing. I remember meeting a nun and being terrified. And yeah, I don't ever remember anybody indoctrinating me. It was how it was. I didn't realise I was very lucky to be living in a nice housing estate until, you know, decades later. I got married in August '69. Totally apolitical, left school at 15. You know, did all those things and had kids and so forth. I had never done any Irish history. You know, I had no background. I remember my husband and I sort of briefly thought we should become mad Republicans because everybody had betrayed us. You know, we used to dance along with the bands and the 12th and all the rest of it. And when we started to see the other side, he was from the Shankill, you know, it was, you know. And it wasn't until I got an education, and indeed the best part of my education was teaching in Conway Mill on the Falls Road, because I was teaching people whose lives had been totally disrupted. My parents just couldn't believe I was going in because it was the 70s and 80s and stuff. But you know, so I grew up with that. And in fact, I'm very regarded as the black sheep of my family in a whole lot of ways, you know. But it's so the scaremongering is so easy. It's just another layer. And it's not that people are evil, it's the way it is, and they're told how unfair it is for them, and their jobs are going to be taken, or whatever. I mean, I look back on how I used to be with a sort of horror. Why did I not know anything? But how would I have until I got a broad education, you know? And I just think this is so important because, of course, then it was Catholics and Protestants, and that was it. You know, so anyway.
John, how would you have found middle class circles that you moved in, your parents moved in? How would they have viewed the state in the
well,
60s?
yeah, I mean, I just had a very working class upbringing, and always was. I mean, you know, still in the housing estate, but it wasn't until my parents, what happened to my parents was very interesting. When I got married, I was 19, I got married and went off, lived in a wee bed sitting in Belfast. But my parents decided to move to a new house. All these new houses were being built between Andersontown and Suffolk. So my poor parents moved into Lenadoon Avenue.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Now, you know, my young sister, who's very much younger than the rest of us, her memories are of being shot at, of bullets through bedroom windows and so forth. So it's very difficult for us to have a political conversation about that time. You know, even though, you know, she knows the context, dear lover, she comes and listens to me sometimes, so, you know, she knows all that intellectually, but she has the emotion of that. And it is to do with class, I think, to a very great extent. And so I was a very mature student of Queen's and all the rest of it. And we kind of, my husband and I found ourselves changing and changing and changing. And moving away from our background, but so many people did it and haven't, and the same on all sides. People grow up in a tradition, and unless they're really challenged or educated, it's hard to see how you can break that cycle.
And John, your own experience of the circles you moved in, how would you find
Well,
people?
I think...
you talked about the bubble, the cocoon.
The cocoon, I think, it's been eroded to a substantial extent. Actually, the arrival of that generation of, in particular, the Catholic students who've never been able to get a third level education before, and they were arriving sort of from the early 60s onwards, the 1947 Education Act. So they had that opportunity. And all these very English lecturers found themselves teaching people like Michael Farrell and John McGuffin, head-the-bins of one kind or another. And I think some of that rubbed off on some of the teachers. And the university also had to begin changing very rapidly in order to kind of respond to what was going on. It was a fairly slow process of change, but those changes were taking place. But as for the academics who were around, sort of who I remember well, a lot of them in the sort of late 50s, early 60s, really utterly uninterested in what was going on.
Wasn't that a quite interesting Huxley
going on? They loved the scenery.
That's John Hughes, coasters, isn't
Yes,
it?
coasters.
John Hughes, yeah. It's very
Was
interesting.
Huxley not involved? Did he not
Huxley was
involved?
great. Huxley was a...
This is the professor who cut the chains on the Sunday swings on
yes,
Sundays.
George
Huxley.
Just down the road, he came back to our house afterwards because it was in Cranmore Park. We lived in Cranmore Avenue. He was friendly with my father. I say my father tended not to get involved. Of course, my father, in some ways an interesting case history. He had been in the British Army during the war, and immediately after the main war was posted to Greece and saw the Greek Civil War, about which he didn't tell us much. And of course the British went into Greece on the side of the monarchy against the communists, and it was an utterly brutal conflict. And he had seen all that, and indeed had played something of a bit part in it. And he had a great fear of, that's one of the reasons he called himself a stateless person. He had a great fear of ethnic, and he was also a medieval historian. So he had a very strong sense of ethnic and religious differences and the appalling bloodbaths they had led to in Europe. In a sense, he forecast the Yugoslav conflict, and maybe he was giving similar warning signals to me, which I didn't listen to.
No, the question was raised by yourself. Just one second, just responding to that about Protestant involvement in civil rights. And one of the most striking testimonies I got was Ivan Cooper, who, coming from a kind of a middle-class family outside the city of Derry at Killaloe, became a manager of a shirt factory, had been in Killaloe, Orange Hall, Orange Lodge and all of that. But he said he met Catholics from the Bogside at Derry City matches in the Brandywell in the mid-late 1960s. Many of them were students at Queen's, first of their family ever to go to third level education, courtesy of the 1947 Act. And after the match, or Derry City won or lost, they would go back to these houses. He would go back with them, and they weren't as anything like the house he came from. And he would find people living in grinding poverty with damp. And eventually, as they took him into their confidence, they would tell him that, in the case of Emma McCann, his mother had actually begged on her knees before the mayor of Derry, begging for a house, and got absolutely nowhere. And he said that's what sparked him to join the civil rights movement and become involved in everything afterwards, until his company eventually said you can choose between managing our shirt factory and civil rights. So I know he's still alive, he's not so well now, but Ivan Cooper told me that for a programme a few years ago, and I thought it was very, very striking. The other thing about working class Protestants not having one man, one vote, absolutely true. And it was Brian Faulkner who gave the reason why. At the Ulster Unionist Council meeting in 1958, a unionist from the Shankill said, listen, why can we have a council vote, which they have in Britain? People had been to Liverpool and London, and they knew the difference, that the two franchises had been assimilated in 1945. But here we had the Elections and Franchise Act, which maintained the old property qualification. And Brian Faulkner was Minister of Home Affairs, his finger very firmly on the orange pulse. And he said to this working class unionist from the Shankill, well, I'll tell you what to tell them. Tell them they can't have one man, one vote on the Shankill Road because of, and these were his actual words, because of Derry, Fermanagh and Tyrone. And that was the view, coming into the 60s, and that was the thing that O'Neill really found it so difficult to deliver, until he reached a point in 68, with the backsliders in his cabinet still resisting the reform programme which was being pushed by London, and he kept telling them London had the purse strings, especially since the welfare state. And he said, we may have to lose Londonderry to save Ulster. This was the issue of one man, one vote. So that was a key issue there. Somebody else would ask. Sorry, John.
I was one of the people who walked on the Fall Road in 1966. But during that period, I was working in the aircraft factory. I was in there in 62, 63. I was one of three out of 120 apprentices, one of three Catholics who went down. One of the first men I went onto the shop floor, I was asked what sports I played. So I thought I'd be clever and say that I played for the Star of the Sea, which was the local soccer team. He said, oh, you're a Fenian then. So I thought I'd be smart, because I actually played for the Wolf Tones, which was the next pitch.
Well, he was a Protestant revolutionary.
In 66, I walked up the Fall Road in my Wolf Tones outfit. But one of the things that hadn't been covered, even, and I've been to 3 sessions, is the role of we've talked about republicanism and the creation of the professionalism and whatever. No one has mentioned the role of the courts and the judiciary in any of this. And it hasn't been mentioned tonight, and I just wonder, would any of the panel have anything they wish to say about how did the judiciary and the courts and the prosecutorial system feed the troubles as much as they say republicanism?
This is post-civil rights, you mean?
Yeah, but yes, and during that period as well.
In the 70s and 80s?
Well, during the period, during the civil rights, but certainly post-68, 69, yes, and into the 70s, how destabilising was the role of the judiciary at that time? And what I would...
That's a huge question, isn't it? I mean, because I suppose in the 60s, you talk about liberal, Sheila Myrnahan, various individuals tried, didn't they, through the courts to challenge equalities here. And, somebody like Brian Walker always argues that the route through the courts could have been pursued more fruitfully.
But the judiciary was as biased as almost everything else.
Yeah.
I was looking at those figures earlier. Don't have them with me. But again, high places tended to be dominated by a particular way of thinking. So individuals trying to bend the structure didn't get very far, but it would be interesting to look more closely at that.
It would be. There's one really interesting point, I just came across this quote. Edmund Warnock, former Unionist Attorney General, said, this is in private, okay, if ever a community had a right to demonstrate against a denial of civil rights, Derry is the finest example. So that's Warnock, deeply conservative unionist. So what they said in letters to one another, some of them, was not what they said to their public.
Where did that...
No, he said it in October 69.
What?
The lid blew off. He said it just in October 69. But he also said that when Derry was gerrymandered, in the 20s and 30s.
In 1936,
In 1936 was the
and he
second.
says it wasn't intended to be permanent.
Yes. Well, we have a letter, haven't we, from Sir Dawson Bates to Lord Craigavon saying that the Derry people have come to me, but they've come almost too late because they're frightened that a nationalist majority may still emerge. I mean, there was a Catholic majority in the city, but not a voting majority. And he says, but however, if these plans are now implemented, this gerrymander, it should save Derry from the nationalist and Sinn Féin parties for at least 50 years. And he was almost right.
You could go back, of course. You always have to remember, I suppose, neither Fermanagh nor Tyrone had a unionist majority in 1921. And that, you know, Arthur Balfour had said to Ulster Unionists, you'd be better off with 4. You can manage that much more easily. But the whole thing of demography preyed upon the leadership all the time. That's what all the gerrymanders were about, yes?
Well, I mean, on that issue, I mean...
And so therefore, like, loads of political... You know, Fianna Fáil gave their backwoods men what they wanted. You know, the Unionist Party... But Fianna Fáil could change. But the political demographics of Northern Ireland, in a way, trapped the Unionist leadership in terms of feeding the same stuff to their supporters endlessly, because it didn't seem to see... I don't want to sound like, you know, like the state was unreformable, but it was very difficult to see how they could reform the state. I mean, historians like, you know, Bjorn Patterson, Covenant will say that what did they do? They just ran it as a unionist state, and to make the adjustment from running it as a unionist state to the language of more liberal unionists earlier, which was, can you bring Catholics on board? Can you make unionists of them?
Well, it was Carson, actually. It was Carson.
Yeah.
Nobody else threw down
I mean,
that challenge.
it's not that Ulster Unionists are uniquely biased or bigoted. It's just the framework within which they operate, and they had to keep feeding their...
Someone recently...
And perpetuating it.
I read an article, the whole thing about the making of the border, given that it's such a big thing now. Yeah. And lots of quotations from the discussions at the time. And they were. There are so many Catholics there are so many... you know, the state was created in that way.
Well, I mean, certainly on that point, Carson said that they had gone into the area almost parish by parish and townland by townland. Everybody relied on the 1911 census. It informed the maps at the Buckingham Palace Conference and all of that. But the key thing was the British government introduced PR in 1919 because they believed minorities in a soon-to-be divided Ireland would benefit from it. PR for local elections, tried in Sligo, it gave nationalist and unionist moderate seats, and they applied it throughout the whole island. The Unionists wanted rid of that pretty early on, and their Local Government Act of 1923 abolished it. PR had been introduced as part of the 1920 Act for the Northern Ireland Parliament. The Unionists argued it was a foreign system. James Craig wanted rid of it, and in the end they allowed a 3-year moratorium after which it would be abolished. It was abolished actually. It could have been abolished in 1925, but there wasn't enough time. It was finally abolished for all elections in 1929. It was Joe Devlin, one of the few nationalists during that partition phase, who argued that if the Southern Unionists had a Senate, which reflected their numbers, and they reviewed 1,500 pieces of legislation in 15 years, then the Northern Nationalists should have a weighted majority in the Senate. But they never got the checks and balances. So, as Craigavon says, by 1933, you had a unionist parliament and a unionist state. His words, by that stage. But there was something else I was going to say there.
We never answered the band's legal question. I think
you're going to raise a point.
Series of sessions.
I just wanted to raise a point in relation to the question, the legal question that was used to make perhaps a couple of points about it. First of all, from the inception of the state and the creation of the judiciary initially, you actually look historically, many of the senior judiciary in Northern Ireland, they were from a unionist background. Many of them, in fact, were members of the Orange Order and indeed the Unionist Party. Some of them were attorneys general, a number of them were attorneys general. But you also see, if you look at the pattern, it was a family thing. You often, for example, had the sons, who were sons rather than
one or two very eminent families,
or even grandchildren, who almost inherited positions within the unionist state, judicial positions within the unionist state, or within the judiciary. So you can actually trace the background of some of the families.
Well, dynasties.
Yes, I don't think it was planned necessarily, but that's how it worked out. in the 1960s and 1970s, there was an analysis carried out in or about the early 1980s in relation to the composition of the judiciary in the 70s and the 80s. And it, in fact, I'm not sure whether it was entirely accurate in every respect, but it concluded that a huge number of people, both on the High Court bench and indeed on the County Court bench, and some at Magistrates Court level, as they were known then, were in fact members and had been long-standing members of the Unionist Party. Some had been members actually of the Orange Order. So that was, I mean, fairly open. It was an open secret. Then, of course, you moved to the question of the non-jury courts, the diplomat courts. But ironically, before the diplomat courts, when you actually had juries, those were problematic in some senses as well.
In Ireland, they always were.
Because of the nature of how the juries were selected. So you had a problem, for example, if you had an area where there was, for example, a unionist majority of the jury, that created problems. So I agree, I think it needs maybe more analysis, certainly historical analysis.
We tend to generalise about it.
Yes.
But that's.
But
I think the family thing is
I
really
should just finally
interesting.
say that I think that the 1980s things were beginning very much to change.
On that point, of course, in the old days, because of biased juries, Belfast cases would be held in Sligo or somewhere else very often. You'll find that. And very often in the troubles of the 20s, before Ireland was divided, they would hear those cases in Belfast. But the other thing was that the mantra in the late 1960s from people like John Taylor, for example, was the first Lord Chief Justice was a Catholic. Absolutely true. But he was Sir Dennis Henry. He was a native of Draperstown, of Gaelic-speaking stock, an eminent lawyer and the only Catholic Unionist MP ever when he was returned for South Londonderry in 1916. Attorney General for Ireland, first Lord Chief Justice, but he was a supporter of the regime in the 1920s. But from the 30s on, nationalists had constantly raised, in speeches, in propaganda, the paucity of Catholics on the bench. By 1945, they were arguing there were no county court judges, and then one was appointed, a retiring nationalist MP, T.J. Campbell. By the mid-50s, they argued, or by the 60s, there were 2 Catholic magistrates, and there was 1 Catholic judge, I think, at that stage. Brookborough in the late 1940s, when the Ireland Act was passed, reinforcing the constitutional position in response to the South declaring a republic, Brookborough demanded 2 things. We talked about one of them last week in the Guildhall, that the state should be renamed Ulster in, contradistinction to the Republic of Ireland, which had just been declared, claiming allegiance over the whole island. And he was told, no, it couldn't be called Ulster because it wasn't Ulster. And then he demanded the right to appoint judges, that Stormont would appoint, the Ministry of Home Affairs would appoint judges. And Attlee was quite generous to Brooke because he was thanking him for Northern Ireland's part in supporting the Allies in World War II, but he refused to allow Stormont to appoint judges. They remained with the Lord Chancellor. And that became an issue for the campaign for social justice, raising that issue. In the Capuchin Annual in 1942, and their pamphlet, which was called Orange Terror, they highlighted the differential in the judiciary and all of that. And you're quite right, every major unionist cabinet minister who was a barrister became a judge. I mean, you had the famous Judge Curran of the Curran murder. Launcelot Curran was not only Minister of Home Affairs, but he was Attorney General. You had Major W.W.B. Topping, became a judge, Attorney General. You had John McDermott. That was a pattern really right through that whole period. And I remember the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985. There was pressure from Dublin for the appointment of an additional Catholic judge, even that late. And in fact, a judge who was from a Catholic background was appointed in 1986. So it remained an issue.
They were part of the problem.
Oh yes, but I mean, even pre-Troubles, this was an issue. Yes, sir.
I think one of the things that makes the 60s so explosive, obviously, is the convergence of a range of things. We've talked about a number of them tonight. The obviously outcome of the Education Act of 47, the growth of the Catholic middle class, the way in which social agitation across the world, all these factors. But a key thing that was happening here was the need for structural reform in the economy. And there had been a series of reports that the government had commissioned, and the option broadly was, do we continue subsidising, things like the shipyard, or do we go for some new regional specialisation? And the option, particularly under the Wilson report, was to go for the latter. And that meant modernisation, physical modernisation, which came through the Matthew report. And the ultimate effect of that was the 1969 Belfast Urban Plan. And that, amongst other things, the decanting of population in the inner city, particularly in very emblematic areas like the Shankill and so on, caused major population decline, particularly of the Protestant working class. And therefore, physically seeing and experiencing that territorial loss and change, alongside a time when they felt they were experiencing political loss of ground, reinforced that sense of loss, particularly in the Protestant working class. So they were very vulnerable to these appeals that we have been talking about tonight, because there was a real material economic basis to their sense of loss.
Because those industries are also declining.
Well, the traditional industries were declining. The new industries they were going to attract were not going to occupy the old industrial spaces. So they had to be decanted to new industrial estates, to the new towns in Craigavon, Antrim and so on. So the loss for the Protestant working class in central areas like Belfast was extremely significant.
But they tended to move out. People moved out of the inner city.
Skilled section of them moved.
Yes.
But it left behind a lot of the less mobile, the larger families, the less skilled and so on. And they were bereft at that time when they felt the overall political edifice was also changing.
And you find that highlighted in the mid-70s, late 70s, after direct rule, when you have the problem of Belfast, which is all about the greening of Belfast. The Shankill has collapsed as a large kind of heartland. People have gone to Green Island, Carrickfergus, searching jobs. It's much smaller than it once was. Donegal Pass and Sandy Row is shrinking. The Falls is growing and grows monumentally from Belfast to Twinbrook in the course of the 1970s, 80s. Then you have the problem of Derry in the files, the movement of 20,000 Protestants from the West Bank across the river. That's starting then, after 72. One Protestant community worker told me that she'd been brought up in the Bogside, but you know, there were some threats to them obviously after Bloody Sunday and that, and they moved, and she said she moved into the waterside, and when she heard the drums that first night, she felt safe. So you have that movement crossing the river all the while as well. So that is, of course, the preliminary scenario to the demographic changes we're going to see in the next few years.
But am I right that really these demographic changes aren't going on to any major extent in 66, 67, 68? They're coming from
the troubles,
and
the decline.
There is actually, I got a quotation from 65, 66 when they're doing the new town, Craigavon, and there's a perceived drop of nearly 6,000 in the Protestant population of Armagh. So there's a whole debate about Craigavon. Will you be attracting in Catholics from different places?
That's a big issue.
Or will it fortify, kind of Lurgan, Portadown? Will it give a skilled Protestant working class a base? So there's overt discussion about demographics, in the mid-60s, particularly about Armagh anyway.
It's also interesting. I did an oral history last year on the Shankill, and as well as the loss of jobs, mills and all the rest of it in that area, and people moving, then there's the loss of the sense of community. You know, families are split up all over the place, and that was what I felt most, I have to say, from that project. That sort of, we're all in it together kind of thing, which in some ways kind of exacerbates sectarianism. But that whole we've lost out.
But it's not something that only happens to the Protestant community.
No, of course not.
You know, consider the case of Sailortown.
Yeah.
You know, the docks area in Belfast, which not only, of course, that redevelopment, but 3/4 of the area was simply buried under motorway overpasses.
Yeah, the combination of the motorway and the housing redevelopment in the 70s meant a loss of half the households in the inner city of Belfast. I mean, you're talking about a major change, which even if you didn't have the other layers going on of the rise of the violence and all the rest, would have been a major political disruption.
Absolutely.
I suppose, would that have been happening in Glasgow, say, at the same time?
Yes, I mean, you have some of the same effects.
It's the concatenation of events here.
But that changes whole areas. I mean, if you take the Lower Ormer Road, streets like the Clure Street, I remember them just sitting like bombed out streets in Belgium during the First World War. And I mean, the people who left those houses went to more unionist loyalist estates because the trouble were underway and the Ormer Road became greener and greener as people moved in. So it actually assisted population movement post-troubles, and of course modernisation caused major problems for unionism because, for example, the attraction of jobs, as we said last week, to Derry, DuPont for example, a unionist inner circle was saying we don't want these factories here because they're going to mean too many nationalists getting jobs. And Brooke was saying, look, I can't stop inward investment, what's going on? But he agreed to appoint a leading Orange man as the personnel officer of DuPont and that kind of thing. So modernisation is a major, major problem there.
It's a major conundrum in another way, which is that they didn't have the money to modernise. They relied on a bigger subvention from Westminster at a time of the Wilson Labour government. And Wilson was basically saying to O'Neill, unless you bring in these reforms, we can't politically sell the idea of giving you more money.
And he's actually saying it in the meetings with O'Neill, Craig and Faulkner in 67, 68. If you don't reform, we will hold back finance. We have the control of the purse strings. O'Neill's trying to tell that to his cabinet. That's the one thing, as I think Margaret said, O'Neill tried to convey to the Unionist cabinet that Westminster, as the Government of Ireland Act, Article 75 had said 50 years before, Westminster was supreme over all things in Northern Ireland. People had forgotten that, you know. The gentleman here just wants to make a final point.
Just a point on the line that I understand that there was a plan in the 60s actually for a ring of motorways around the centre of Belfast.
Nearly knocked down my
The
house.
only part of that ever got built, it used the West Link, and it only became a free-flowing motorway in 2008.
And can I tell you, during the debates on the West Link in 1972, in the last couple of weeks of Stormont, a young junior minister of Home Affairs called John Taylor argued that this would be a perfect security measure to separate the competence on both sides, because you couldn't throw a rock over a six-lane highway. That was a major selling point.
Was something supposed to go through Botanic Avenue?
Oh yes, it was to sweep away a lot of Botanic Avenue, and it kept a lot of people who lived there, including myself, awake at night for a long time.
Then there's the military plan, you can't drive right through those estates and so forth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, my understanding was that that never got developed, partly because of no money, and partly also because it had been recognised in mainland cities like Birmingham and so that the severance.
The Ring Road was abandoned, but the West Link continued.
Yeah, but don't forget what the Ring Road was going to do. I mean, it was on stilts, going right through the inner city of Belfast. And I mean, I was part of the anti-motorway campaign at the time in the 70s, and it wasn't just the fact of money. I think there was mobilisation of opposition, that had an effect.
Sorry, there was somebody just behind you had a point there. Sorry.
I remember, I think it was in the early to mid 70s, of just whole parts of inner city Belfast, Wade Lace, where areas had gone into redevelopment, huge scale redevelopment, so places cleared, not like it's done now where it's leapfrogged and done in small scale, done just huge scale, massive clearance, and very slow and efficient building programs. I remember as a community worker in Belfast in the late 70s, and some communities people say, it was the IRA that did that, which of course it wasn't, but it was that inflation.
Is there someone else? Did you want to raise a point, yes?
I suppose I was kind of interested in the thing that I think has come through a wee bit in each of the speakers around that sort of sense of throughout the civil rights and different parts of history of unionism and concession. And I'm just wondering, I suppose the 60s and civil rights isn't that very long ago. Some of us, for those that maybe weren't there whenever these things were happening, I'm just wondering, how do you feel that that sense of concession and the civil rights sort of now plays out in narratives, in our modern politics and the modern issues that we would have?
Maybe a briefer answer. Now we're coming to the end. John?
Well, I think an awful problem for unionism is that it only ever celebrated one revolution, which actually was the Glorious Revolution, 1690 and all that. And everything since then, from the perspective of unionism, has been a threat, a risk, or even a disaster. And I mean, I think that in any society, you have to have some sense of the possibility of, if humanity is a positive thing, you have to have some sense of progress and getting to a better place. And the question for unionism is, how would you propose to actually get to a better place?
Well, in fairness, they're just trying to avoid getting to one place, which is called the United Ireland. You know, I mean, being realistic.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have moved a lot, of course, and many of the rights that people fought for have been granted. But that original issue of this, and again, it's, you know, like a backstop is going to be temporary. The border was going to be temporary. And, you know, we got a solution that was never a solution. And just, you know, I think one generation after another is trying to resolve the problem we have.
What Ireland needs is 32 borders. Further opportunities for smuggling.
But on that point that Margaret makes, I mean, the original border was to be for 9 counties. We were just saying that earlier on the way up, actually, that 9 counties was the proposal of the Long Committee, which drew up the Government of Ireland Act. But it was James Craig who intervened very late in the day. He was a junior minister. He was sure-footed in the corridors of power, and he actually said that he didn't want 9 counties. They would be ungovernable, and a 6-county unit would Protestant representation would be strengthened. And so the government fell back on this plan for 6 counties, which had been mooted before, admittedly. But the people of County Cavan, Monaghan, Donegal didn't realise that until the very end they were being considered for inclusion in a Belfast Parliament, which they felt, the committee felt, Liberal and Tory would be more logical than a 6-county unit. And I think the other thing is that, as Michael Laffin has said, and Margaret will be aware of this too, that the Unionists in many ways acted like European nationalists after the First World War. They wanted buffer zones, and they brought in more territory than they were entitled to. The Fermanahs, the Tyrones, the South Armagh, and this became a kind of a Trojan horse in the troubled politics of the future, you know.
The thing is, the 6 counties now is demographically what the 9 counties were.
Exactly. We're exactly where they, if not slightly worse.
I wonder how much the symbolism of Derry counted in what the Unionists wanted to hang on to.
Well, it was James Craig who said that it was an Ulster Thermopylae. That's how he described Derry in 1922. So it was a very great...
That's one reason why you don't go for really, say, 4 counties.
Yes.
Because you can't possibly give up Derry, London.
But it also, it wasn't even that. It was the landed gentry of those counties who were very sympathetic to their neighbours in Cavan and Monaghan. Yeah. They wanted to be included in the Ulster Pale because they were obviously Anglo-Irish. They wanted to be, they'd served their country in wars and all the rest of it. They had managed Ireland for centuries. And the people like Hugh de Fenenberg Montgomery of Fife Mountain, like Basil Brooke, who took the first steps to establishing beef specials in Fermanagh before the government took that on board, they wanted their counties to be included in the Pale. When you get into Cavan and Monaghan, you were going into areas of smaller Protestant populations, which might drag down the rest towards a united Ireland. But the gentry were important in that period, in that great cross-class alliance that Margaret talked about earlier on, you know. One thing I do remember, though, which is interesting and an echo of the past, though a very positive echo from the Ulster crisis of 1912-14 in this period. People's Democracy in 1969 organised protests all over Belfast against rising bus fares. They were bringing in decimal currency. Everything went up. I remember old people saying to me, it's this new money, it's all this new money, you know. And everything doubled. And PD sent out squads, maybe you were one of them, John, into the Shankill, the Falls, North Belfast. And on the Shankill, the PD 12, wherever, were routed by local sort of roughnecks arrived and chased them. And a letter appeared in the Belfast Telegraph, which I have seen, signed by 20 members of the 36th Ulster Division. And they said that they had fought for king and country in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme. And they invited PD back to stand with them to protest against the rising bus fares. And that was in the middle of 1969, post-Burnt-Holland. So it's quite interesting that something like that could happen in this increasingly, admittedly, polarising society, which we're talking about, by the summer of 69, you know. John, we have to let a few more in.
Yeah, well, I was just going to make just a few brief comments, but I think it is worth mentioning, and some speakers have alluded to, that bleak and all as the situation was in terms of discrimination, and it's all well documented and irrefutable. But at the same time, there was huge social and economic change taking place north and south. And that was epitomised by what would become eventually the new political leadership of both unionism and nationalism, as represented, say, by Brian Faulkner. And in the south, you know, De Valera had been replaced by Lamass, and there was no more Madeley Commons at the crossroads. And people had very good reason to be terrified of nuns and priests, as we well know. So this was against a backdrop of huge social and economic change, modernisation, growing influences of internationalism, the EEC, and all of that. I suppose maybe they were playing political catch-up, but it was the events of 1969 which possibly set all of this back, because the facts are, in many respects, that whatever we might think of O'Neill, but very quickly during that whole period, nearly all of the basic demands of the civil rights movement were indeed granted, and all of these reforms were eventually introduced. Things like proportional representation, which was reintroduced, the ending of gerrymandering in local government, the establishment of the housing executive, the introduction of one man, one vote, all of those things. And just, you know, I think, you know, that really what did go wrong was that Paisley did successfully fan the fears of Protestant people, unionist people, about what the intentions of the civil rights movement were, the Republican scare. That did play a big part in poisoning the situation at that time, because there had been positive things happening even before all that violence. And when you mentioned about the PD, about the rise in bus fares, people like Billy Mill were going up onto the Shankill as far back as 1964 with Margaret Miskimmon, who went on to become a DUP councillor, to talk about educational standards on the Shankill. They were constantly trying to point out about the commonality of problems between the Falls and the Shankill. And on the point about what was happening in the Republican movement at that time, yes, in many respects it is complex, but at the same time, I don't think that there's any doubt that when Bombay Street and things like that happened, it was a cue for elements within the Republican movement who had been dormant for some time, who took up the challenge not of greater equality, not of greater reform. Their war cry was, and literally was a war cry, England, damn your concessions, it's our freedom we want. And that's what they went on to ultimately futile, to attempt a war to drive Britain out of Northern Ireland. So I think there were many positives about the period as well.
We've just done that, in fact. Austin Curry, who was one of the civil rights leaders, has written that he believed it was the most successful mobilisation in Irish history, in that it achieved every objective it had set in 1967. They were all achieved by April 69, when the final one was granted, reluctantly, admittedly, by about 4 votes in the Unionist Party, and that was one man, one vote. But they were all achieved peacefully.
That's entirely true, because fair employment legislation.
Oh yes, admittedly, he says
was the big gap, and that really wasn't achieved until
73.
Well, that was the first one, but it was strengthened in the
1989 Act. It became a major.
And I mean, that has had a transformative effect.
Okay, folks. Okay, we're really waking up here.
I just want to return very briefly to something that Myrtle said right at the beginning. And I recognise that period when you were studying and going to get married in 1966-69, because I was doing O-levels in 1966, and I was completely, as a Protestant, unaware of what had been going on in Northern Ireland since the end of the Second World War. I think I was sleepwalking, and I think many of us were sleepwalking at that time. And it wasn't until very recently that I went down to Dublin to the exhibition in the General Post Office there, that I realised that Nelson's column was blown up in 1966 as a commemoration
There was a song about it.
1916. And that had never occurred to me. I heard that broadcast on the radio in Jack DeManio's programme when I was going out to school. But it never occurred to me that that was in fact the beginning of what we were going to see for the next 30 or 40 years.
Unfortunately, I didn't do any studying in 1966. I was married with children by the time I did that. But it is that thoughtlessness. It's, you know, when I look back on my childhood and the radio on, it was all about the price of pigs and stuff. You know, and farming and
I think most people are like that at 16, sure.
Well, maybe so. You were only interested in, and you know, I left school at 15 and got a job, which you could do in that time, or at least I could do. And just went around going out with boys and getting married and having kids. I used to think I made those choices. Yeah. Of course I didn't. It's what you did in my family. You put no money, you know, you went out and got a job. And you got married young and you did all those things, you know. The choices came much later.
But the other big thing that's been mentioned by various people, and it's a key background factor to all of this, catalyst for change, was the 1947 Education Act, being availed of in particular by the minority community, through the schools, the convents, the Christian Brothers, the diocesan colleges, which swelled. I mean, I was archivist for my sins many years ago in St. Malachy's College, and you suddenly see by 1948-49 the mushrooming of numbers as the day boys arrive from the New Lodge Road and Ardoyne into the school. And that is a driver.
But to qualify that a bit, Eamon, very importantly, if you look at the pattern of Catholic education in the course of all those decades, there was a preference given by the institution to grammar schools, next to boys' secondary schools, and laterally to girls' secondary schools. I mean, St. Gemma's, as some of us in the room know, as a Catholic secondary girls' school, now closed, wasn't open until 1967. And the girls in the Old Park Ardoyne area, on the Catholic side, were really given an extended primary education up until 1967.
And the exams were marked differently for boys and girls as well.
Yeah, but I mean, a very disgraceful internal discrimination going on within the Catholic system.
But you would accept that the grammar schools make a big difference.
They do make a big difference.
Rising civil rights movement. Yes?
Sorry, just on the school system, the 47 Education Act was very, very important. It was a shame it wasn't brought into the non-sectarian schools. I mean, that was the thing, it should be civil rights to the 44 as well.
Well, they would be fighting against the tide of history, of course, because there were problems with the introduction of the national schools. By the 1840s, the churches were asserting their power.
The Catholic Church actually was opposed to.
But so were they. I mean, in the 20s, both major communions were opposed to it. The Protestant churches handed over their schools on condition that they had certain controls. The Catholic schools opted out. So you had a dual system which continued what had been there at primary level in the 19th century. Well, look, folks, can I thank you all? We've had a tremendous discussion here tonight. I think we've had, this is our third session, but certainly we haven't been disappointed by Larne this evening. Can I thank our speakers? I didn't mean to pick on poor old Margaret here at all. To Myrtle as well, to Dr. Myrtle Hill, and of course Dr. Margaret O'Callaghan and Mr. John Gray. Thank you very much.
Thank you.